The USS Abraham Lincoln and the Navy's readiness problem. The return of the USS Abraham Lincoln is obviously good news for the thousands of sailors and Marines aboard that ship and for their families back home. But I think that this story becomes much bigger when you stop looking at the Lincoln as one carrier coming back home and start looking at why it had to stay out there for so long in the first place. The Lincoln left San Diego in November and now has been gone for roughly 9 months, including more than 200 consecutive days at sea. That's substantially longer than roughly 7 month carrier deployment the Navy normally tries to operate around. The Gerald R. Ford recently returned from an even longer deployment of roughly 11 months. The Iran War had forced the Navy to keep some of its most valuable assets and the people aboard them forward for much longer than originally intended. For the families that matter enormously. These aren't just pieces just moving around on a Pentagon map. You're talking about thousands of spouses running households without their partners, children spending most of the year without a parent physically present, and parents wondering if their son or daughter is finally coming home. And some Lincoln families have spent the last several weeks hearing disturbing uh, reports about food, sanitation, and sailors' mental health aboard the ship. There's a phrase worth remembering here: ships don't deploy, people do. But ships also pay a price. Aircraft carriers are extraordinary machines, but they aren't indestructible. Additional months at sea means additional flight operations, stress on the flight deck, catapults, and arresting gear, more operating hours on electrical and mechanical systems, and maintenance that either has to happen underway or gets pushed into the future. There's even been reports from family members about deteriorating of portions of the flight deck. Now, we should be careful with that claim because we don't necessarily have independent Navy damage assessment confirming everything that families have described. But the larger maintenance issue isn't controversial. Extending deployments eventually creates a maintenance bill. And we're talking about some of the most expensive military equipment humans have ever constructed. Future Ford class characters are projected to cost around $22 billion apiece. So the question isn't simply, can America keep aircraft characters at sea for another month? Obviously it can. The better question would be, what are we consuming by doing this? Because the United States technically has 11 aircraft carriers. But that doesn't mean 11 carriers are sitting around waiting for the president to deploy them. The Navy essentially operates through a readiness cycle. Some carriers are deployed or available, others are training or preparing to deploy. Others have recently returned, and still others have undergone maintenance, sometimes major maintenance lasting years. That's why having only roughly 3 or 4 carriers readily available or deployed at any given moment isn't necessarily evidence that the Navy is failing. To some extent, that's how the system is designed. The Iran war changed the equation because suddenly several of those available characters can be consumed by one theater. And at one point, the United States had 3 carriers committed to the Middle East. And now the George Washington has been moved from the Western Pacific to relieve the Lincoln. Now, think about what that means strategically. You're not manufacturing another carrier because Iran needs one. You're moving an existing carrier from somewhere else. And that gets us into something the military calls force generations. Force generations is basically the military ability to continuously produce forces that are trained, equipped, maintained, rested, and actually ready to deploy. The Lincoln became a very visible symptom of what happens when that system gets strained. The problem isn't that the United States cannot generate tremendous naval combat power. Clearly, it can. The question is, how long can you regenerate that combat power? without extending deployments, delayed maintenance, exhausted crews, or pulling forces away from another part of the world because America doesn't get to choose when the next crisis happens. Iran can be happening when China is pressuring Taiwan. North Korea can escalate while ships are undergoing maintenance. Something unexpectedly can happen tomorrow. And suddenly, the difference between America has 11 aircraft carriers and America has 3 or 4 carriers actually available becomes extremely important. That's also why congressional oversight piece bothers me. Members of Congress have been demanding additional information from the Pentagon about conditions aboard the Lincoln, including personnel readiness, material readiness, maintenance, supplies, and what happens after the extended deployment. Obviously, Congress doesn't need every operational detail publicly released during an act of war. There are legitimate reasons military information is classified, but classified information and information hidden from congressional oversight are not the same thing. Congress funds the military. Congress writes defense policy. And Congress possesses constitutional responsibility involving war. If lawmakers don't have a clear understanding of what extended deployments are doing to ships and sailors, how much maintenance is being deferred, how many carriers are generally available, and what risks we're accepting elsewhere to sustain operations against Iran, then Congress can intelligently judge whether the current tempo is sustainable. And that brings us to Stars and Stripes and the Pentagon's increasingly contentious relationship with journalism. First, Stars and Stripes hasn't stopped publishing, it's still operating, but something significant is happening there. Stars and Stripes occupies a strange position. It's supported partly by the Defense Department and primarily serves the military community. Congress has historically protected its editorial independence. Its longtime publisher, Max Lederer, announced his retirement after saying he fundamentally differed from Pentagon leadership over the newspaper's direction. At the same time, the Trump administration's Pentagon has been involved in a much broader confrontation with military journalists. Reporters have lost access they historically have inside the Pentagon. Dozens surrendered their credentials rather than accepting new restrictions, and access to Pentagon officials and spaces have become considerably tighter. Stars and Stripes has been doing aggressive reporting about conditioning aboard the Lincoln. Now, this is exactly where we have to follow the evidence rather than jump ahead of it. We do not currently have evidence establishing that the Pentagon disputes with Stars and Stripes is retaliation for this reporting about the Lincoln. Those things are happening at the same time. That doesn't prove one caused the other, but they do much expose a much larger disagreement over what military journalism is supposed to be. Should journalism covering the Defense Department primarily communicate the military's warfighter mission and accomplishment? Or should journalists independently investigate the institution, including reporting on readiness problems, poor living conditions, leadership failure, and information the Pentagon would rather not see on the front page? I think the answer has to be the second one, because the Lincoln demonstrated exactly why independent scrutiny matters. This isn't simply a story about a aircraft carrier finally sailing home. It's a story about people, machines, readiness, and institutional capacity. How long can we keep sailors deployed? How quickly are we consuming the useful life and maintenance capacity of enormous expensive ships? How many carriers can America actually generate simultaneously? What happens when one war begins consuming forces intended to deter another? Does Congress fully understand the readiness costs being accumulated? And are journalists still able to independently investigate those questions? The USS Abraham Lincoln coming home is unquestionably a relief for thousands of military families. But the ship pulling into port doesn't make those larger questions disappear. In some way, that's when we finally get the opportunity to start answering.